The biggest mistake Aurora Whitmore ever made was giving a bath to a giant black wolf. 3 months later, the Alpha King still refused to leave her cottage. Aurora didn't know any of that on the freezing morning when fate quietly stepped across her threshold. Winter still ruled the wilderness around Silver Lake. Snow drifted through towering pine trees, a thin layer of ice shimmered along the shoreline, and smoke curled from the chimney of a small wooden cottage hidden at the edge of the forest. The world looked peaceful enough to belong in a painting. Then Aurora stepped onto her porch carrying 2 wooden buckets filled with water and immediately proved why the villagers called her the most accident-prone Omega in 3 counties. Her boot landed on a patch of ice. She slipped. The buckets flew upward. 2 gallons of freezing water launched through the air and crashed directly onto the largest black wolf she had ever seen. Silence followed. Aurora froze. The wolf froze. Water dripped from thick black fur onto untouched snow. Slowly, the creature lifted his head and fixed her with a stare so intense that her heart skipped a beat. His eyes were silver. Not gray. Silver. Sharp enough to cut through the winter haze. Intelligent enough to make her wonder if he understood every word she said. "Oh," Aurora whispered. The wolf continued staring. "That was an accident." No response. "In my defense, I almost fell too." The wolf looked deeply unconvinced. Aurora sighed. "Well, this is awkward." A cold wind swept across the clearing, carrying snow between them. That was when she noticed what she had missed at first. Beneath the wolf's intimidating size was exhaustion. His breathing seemed heavier than it should have been. His fur was tangled from days in the wilderness. And despite his strength, there was something lonely in his eyes. Aurora's expression softened immediately. "You poor thing." The wolf looked away as if personally offended by her sympathy. "Yep," Aurora said. "That definitely means you're having a rough day." Hidden behind those silver eyes, King Lucien Ashford silently questioned every decision that had brought him here. He was the Alpha King, the ruler of the strongest packs in the kingdom, a man respected by warriors and feared by rivals. Yet somehow he had ended up soaked, exhausted, and being judged by a blonde Omega who couldn't walk across her own porch without creating a disaster. "Wait here," Aurora said suddenly. To her surprise, the wolf obeyed. She hurried inside and returned carrying an old wool blanket. Carefully, she draped it over his shoulders. "You look freezing." Lucien stared at her. No one had looked at him like that in years. No one had seen a creature in need of help instead of a king burdened by responsibility. Something unfamiliar stirred inside him. Before he could examine the feeling, Aurora clapped her hands. "Right, you're coming inside." The wolf immediately became suspicious. 20 minutes later, he discovered he had been right. Warm firelight glowed inside the cottage. Lavender scented the air. Outside, the snowstorm slowly swallowed the forest. Inside, everything felt warm and alive. Aurora pointed toward a large metal tub beside the fireplace. "In." The wolf stared at the tub, then at Aurora, then back at the tub. "Don't be dramatic." He refused to move. Aurora narrowed her eyes. "Wait." Her mouth slowly fell open. "Are you scared of baths?" One black ear twitched. Aurora gasped. "You are." Her laughter filled the cottage, bright and contagious. A giant terrifying wolf is afraid of soap. Lucien closed his eyes. This was undoubtedly the lowest point of his royal career. Unfortunately, it got worse. Aurora won the argument. Warm water splashed. Lavender foam covered black fur. She scrubbed while carrying on a cheerful conversation entirely by herself. "Honestly, Shadow, you're lucky I found you." The wolf froze. "Shadow," she repeated. "That's your name now." Outside, snow battered the windows. Inside, golden firelight painted the room in shades of amber and gold. At one point, Aurora nearly slipped on a puddle beside the tub. Before she could fall, Lucien moved without thinking. In a blur of black fur, he stepped between her and the floor, steadying her. Aurora blinked. Then she smiled. "Thank you, Shadow." For some reason, that simple smile affected him more than it should have. Later, as the storm deepened, Aurora wrapped herself in a blanket near the fire while Shadow stretched out beside the hearth. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, settling quietly into his memory. Somehow, Lucien knew he would remember that scent long after the winter ended. Outside, the snowstorm swallowed the forest. Inside, A blonde omega sat beside the fire while a giant black wolf watched her in silence. Neither of them knew it yet, but destiny had already crossed the cottage threshold. Before heading to bed, Aurora knelt beside him and scratched gently behind one ear. "Good night, Shadow." Lucien watched her disappear down the hallway. He should leave before sunrise. His kingdom would be searching for him. His duties waited beyond the forest. Yet as the cottage settled into peaceful silence and the faint sound of Aurora moving in the next room reached his ears, the Alpha King rested his head beside the fire. For the first time in years, power didn't matter. Duty didn't matter. All that mattered was the strange peace he had found beside a frozen lake, in a tiny cottage, with a clumsy omega who smelled faintly of lavender. Deep down, he already knew one thing. He wasn't leaving tomorrow. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Aurora woke to the sound and immediately sat upright in bed. For one alarming second, she thought someone had broken into her cottage. Then she remembered the giant black wolf sleeping beside her fireplace. Pulling on a sweater, she hurried into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. Shadow stood beside a basket of apples with one hanging from his mouth. Another rolled across the floor. The wolf froze. Aurora stared. Shadow stared back. "Are you eating my apples?" she asked. Silence. "You are a wolf." More silence. "Wolves do not eat apples." Shadow slowly finished chewing. Aurora burst out laughing. Sunlight poured through the frosted windows, turning the little cottage golden. Outside, fresh snow sparkled across Silver Lake. Inside, the scent of lavender still lingered softly in the air. Somehow, the cottage already felt different with Shadow in it. Less quiet. Less lonely. "Well," Aurora said, tying her hair back. "If you are staying here, we need rules." One silver eye opened. Rule number 1. No stealing food. The wolf blinked. Rule number 2. No tracking mud inside. His gaze shifted toward a trail of paw prints crossing the floor. "That is a confession." Aurora pointed at him. "I knew it." An hour later, she set a large wooden bowl beside the fireplace. Shadow glanced at it, then at her, then back at the bowl. "Breakfast." The wolf did not move. Aurora folded her arms. "Do not give me that look." Still nothing. "You spent the morning stealing apples." Shadow remained perfectly still. Aurora sighed dramatically. "Fine. Be stubborn." She turned and walked toward the kitchen. Seconds later, she heard soft footsteps behind her. Looking over her shoulder, she discovered the giant wolf following her. "Oh, now you move." The corners of her mouth twitched. "You are impossible." The rest of the morning only became stranger. Wherever Aurora went, Shadow followed. When she carried firewood, he followed. When she checked the chicken coop, he followed. When she collected water from the pump, he followed. Finally, she stopped in the middle of the yard and turned around. "Shadow." The wolf stopped. "Sit." Nothing happened. "Sit." The wolf stared at her with royal disapproval. Aurora sighed. "Okay, have it your way." She shrugged and walked toward the cottage. 5 seconds later, she heard him padding after her again. Aurora laughed so hard she nearly dropped her bucket. Hidden beneath black fur, King Lucien Ashford questioned how his life had reached this point. He ruled an entire kingdom. Thousands obeyed his commands. Yet somehow he was being trained by an omega who slipped on ice and talked to chickens. Worse, he was beginning to enjoy it. By afternoon, Aurora decided to walk into the nearby village. Shadow accompanied her immediately. The moment they arrived, conversation stopped. Martha Reed nearly dropped a tray of fresh bread. Samuel Brooks took one look at the giant black wolf and stepped behind a wagon. "Aurora," Martha called carefully. "Why is there a wolf beside you?" Aurora smiled. "This is Shadow." The wolf sat beside her. "Shadow." "Yes." "The giant wolf." "Yes." "The giant wolf." "Named Shadow." That is usually how names work. Several villagers exchanged nervous looks. Aurora gently patted the top of Shadow's head. The entire street went silent. Lucien endured the humiliation with what little dignity he had left. "See," Aurora said proudly. "He is sweet." Shadow looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at Shadow. Nobody seemed convinced except Aurora. As evening settled over the forest, they returned to the cottage. Snow drifted beyond the windows while firelight danced across the wooden walls. Aurora curled beneath a blanket near the hearth. Shadow stretched out beside her chair. The scent of lavender lingered softly between them. Lucien listened to her humming while she mended an old scarf. The sound was simple, peaceful, strangely comforting. He realized he had started looking forward to her laughter, looking forward to her voice, looking forward to the quiet moments inside this little cottage. "Looks like you are staying another day," Aurora said sleepily. Shadow lifted his head. Aurora smiled and reached down to scratch behind one ear. "Good." Hidden behind silver eyes, the Alpha King knew he should leave before sunrise. His kingdom needed him. His responsibilities waited beyond the forest. Yet as Aurora yawned beside the fire and the warmth of the cottage settled around him, a ridiculous thought crossed his mind. Aurora believed she had adopted a stray wolf. Lucien was beginning to suspect he had been adopted instead. By the third morning, Shadow had become as much a part of Aurora's cottage as the fireplace and the rocking chair by the window. Aurora discovered this when she opened her front door and nearly tripped over a giant black wolf already waiting for her. "Good morning to you too," she said. Shadow rose immediately. Aurora laughed. "You know, normal wolves do not wait outside people's doors." He followed her down the porch steps anyway. Fresh snow sparkled around Silver Lake, while pale sunlight painted the frozen shoreline silver and gold. The air smelled of pine trees and winter. Aurora carried a small basket on her arm. "We are gathering berries today. Try not to scare anything." Shadow glanced at her. That was a joke. She informed him. Mostly, they spent the morning wandering through the forest trails surrounding the lake. Aurora talked almost nonstop. She talked about her chickens. She talked about Martha's bakery. She talked about the time she accidentally locked herself in her own shed for 2 hours. Shadow listened to every story. The strange thing was that Lucien genuinely enjoyed them. No one had ever spoken to him this freely before. Around a king, people chose every word carefully. Around Shadow, Aurora simply spoke from her heart. Later, while resting beside the lakeshore, Aurora pulled a knitted scarf from her basket. It was uneven, slightly crooked. One side looked longer than the other. "I made this," she announced proudly. Shadow studied the scarf with concern. "Do not look at it like that." Aurora narrowed her eyes. "It is supposed to look like this." The wolf remained unconvinced. Aurora sighed dramatically before stepping closer. "Hold still." Before Lucien understood what was happening, she wrapped the scarf around his neck. The giant black wolf froze. Aurora stepped back and admired her work. Perfect. The scarf hung awkwardly across thick black fur. "Now you look respectable." Lucien stared at her. Aurora burst into laughter. "Oh, Shadow. You hate it." The Alpha King of the Northern Territories had once worn ceremonial robes worth thousands of gold crowns. Somehow this crooked scarf was far more humiliating. Unfortunately, Aurora loved it. The situation became even worse when they passed through the village later that afternoon. Martha Reed nearly dropped a tray of fresh bread. Samuel Brooks stared openly. Even the children stopped playing. Aurora waved cheerfully. "Everyone look. Shadow has a scarf." Nobody knew how to respond. The giant black wolf sat beside her wearing a knitted blue scarf and looking deeply disappointed with life. Aurora smiled proudly. "Does he not look handsome?" Shadow closed his eyes. At least 3 villagers looked as though they were trying very hard not to laugh. As they walked home, Aurora continued smiling. I think they liked it. Lucien had a feeling the villagers liked the situation far more than the scarf. By evening, snow drifted gently outside the cottage windows. Firelight filled the room with warm golden light. Aurora sat beside the hearth working on another knitting project while Shadow rested nearby. Every now and then she reached over and absent-mindedly scratched behind one of his ears. Lucien hated how much he enjoyed that. "Can I tell you something?" Aurora asked softly. The wolf lifted his head. She smiled at the fire. "I used to think this place was too quiet." Her fingers paused on the yarn. "Now it feels different." Shadow watched her. Better, actually. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cottage settled around them with familiar warmth. The scent of lavender lingered in the air. Outside, winter covered the world in white. Inside, Aurora yawned and eventually fell asleep in her chair with yarn tangled in her lap. Lucien remained awake beside the fire. He listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing. He looked at the half-finished scarf. He looked at the peaceful little cottage beside Silver Lake. These should have been ordinary days. Yet they were quickly becoming the happiest days he could remember. And for the first time since arriving here, a troubling thought settled into his heart. He was no longer worried about staying. He was beginning to worry about leaving. The trouble started because of a chicken. Not a dangerous chicken. Not a rare chicken. Just an ordinary brown hen named Daisy. Aurora was carrying a basket of feed across the yard when Daisy came running toward her, flapping her wings enthusiastically. "There you are," Aurora laughed. She crouched down and scooped the hen into her arms. "I was looking for you." A few feet away, Shadow stopped walking. The giant black wolf watched as Aurora smiled at the chicken, scratched under its beak, and carried it toward the coop like it was the most precious creature in the world. "You are definitely my favorite," Aurora told Daisy. Shadow's ears twitched. The hen made a happy noise. Aurora laughed again. For reasons Lucien could not explain, he immediately disliked the bird. The problem only grew worse over the next few days. Every morning, Aurora greeted Daisy before anyone else. Every afternoon, she checked on Daisy. Every evening, she carried extra feed to Daisy. "Look how cute she is," Aurora said one afternoon. Shadow looked at the chicken. The chicken looked at Shadow. Neither of them appeared impressed by the other. "You should try being friendlier," Aurora told the wolf. Daisy pecked happily at the ground. Shadow turned away. Aurora sighed dramatically. "Honestly, Shadow, you are acting jealous." The wolf nearly stumbled. Jealous? Of a chicken? Ridiculous. He was King Lucien Ashford, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. He commanded armies. He negotiated treaties. He ruled powerful packs. He was not jealous of a bird that weighed less than 10 pounds. Unfortunately, the evidence suggested otherwise. The next morning, Aurora sat on a small stool beside the coop, while Daisy perched comfortably in her lap. Shadow immediately positioned himself between Aurora and the chicken. "Shadow," Aurora said. The wolf pretended not to hear her. "You are sitting on Daisy." Shadow remained exactly where he was. Aurora narrowed her eyes. "Move." Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped aside. Daisy hopped back into Aurora's lap. A few minutes later, Shadow returned and sat even closer. Aurora stared at him. "No," the wolf blinked innocently. By afternoon, the entire village had begun noticing the strange rivalry. Martha Reed stood outside the bakery watching as Aurora walked through town, carrying a basket in one hand and Daisy in the other. Shadow followed directly beside her. Every time Aurora looked down at the chicken, the wolf moved closer. Every time she spoke to Daisy, Shadow somehow inserted himself into the conversation despite being physically incapable of speaking. "Am I imagining this?" Martha asked Samuel Brooks. Samuel watched the wolf carefully. "No, is that wolf jealous of a chicken?" "I think he is." Neither of them knew what to do with that information. Later that evening, Aurora sat beside the fireplace with Daisy resting peacefully in her lap. Snow drifted beyond the cottage windows. The scent of lavender filled the room. Shadow lay nearby pretending to sleep. Aurora gently stroked the hen's feathers. "You are such a sweet girl." One silver eye immediately opened. Aurora noticed. Then she noticed the way Shadow was watching Daisy. Then she noticed how he always appeared whenever Daisy received attention. A slow smile spread across her face. "Oh my goodness." Shadow froze. Aurora pointed at him. "Shadow," the wolf looked away. "Are you jealous of a chicken?" Silence. Aurora burst into laughter so hard she nearly dropped the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You are." Shadow stood up and walked toward the fireplace with as much dignity as possible. Unfortunately, dignity was difficult to maintain when being accused of competing with a hen. Aurora continued laughing until tears filled her eyes. Much later, as the fire crackled softly and Daisy slept in her coop, Aurora reached down and scratched behind one of Shadow's ears. "Do not worry," she whispered. "You are still my favorite." To his eternal embarrassment, that made him feel much better. The first sign that something had changed came on a morning when Aurora woke up and immediately looked toward the fireplace. The spot beside the hearth was empty. Her heart skipped once. "Shadow?" she called before she was fully awake. For a brief second, worry tightened in her chest. Then a familiar black shape appeared from the kitchen carrying one of her stolen apples. Relief arrived so quickly that she laughed at herself. "There you are." Shadow paused. "I thought you left." The words were simple, yet Lucien found himself carrying them for the rest of the day. Later that morning, they walked beside Silver Lake beneath a pale blue sky. Winter was slowly surrendering to spring. Thin sheets of ice floated near the shoreline while sunlight danced across the water between the pine trees. Aurora carried a basket filled with supplies for a picnic. Shadow followed beside her as always. Somewhere along the path, Neither of them noticed how naturally they had learned to move together. When she stopped, he stopped. When she turned, he turned. It felt effortless, familiar, dangerous. They settled beneath a large pine overlooking the lake. Aurora unpacked bread, fruit, and a small jar of honey. "You know," she said, looking out across the water, "I used to think I would leave this place one day." Shadow lifted his head. "I wanted to see the world." She smiled softly. "Now I am not so sure." The breeze carried the scent of pine needles and melting snow. For a moment, neither of them moved. Lucien found himself wishing he could answer her. There were countless places he could show her. Mountains, cities, castles. Yet somehow none of them felt more beautiful than this simple afternoon beside Silver Lake. As the day continued, Aurora leaned back against the tree trunk while reading from an old book she had brought along. Her voice drifted through the quiet forest. Lucien listened without pretending otherwise. Eventually the words faded. Silence settled between them. When he glanced over, he realized Aurora had fallen asleep. The open book rested forgotten in her lap. Slowly, her head tilted sideways until it came to rest against his shoulder. Everything inside him froze. Aurora remained asleep, completely unaware of what she had done. Lucien stayed perfectly still. He could feel the warmth of her beside him. He could smell lavender lingering faintly in her hair. The scent had become familiar over the past weeks. Comforting. Safe. Home. Yet now it affected him differently. Stronger. The sensation was impossible to ignore. For the first time, Lucien realized the danger was no longer the kingdom searching for him. The danger was Aurora herself. Not because she threatened him, because she mattered too much. Much later, they returned to the cottage as snowflakes drifted lazily through the evening air. Aurora remained unusually cheerful. Shadow remained unusually quiet. Even Daisy seemed to notice something different. "You are acting strange today," Aurora informed him while hanging her coat near the door. The wolf looked away. "See? That?" Aurora laughed. "Definitely strange." As darkness settled outside, she sat beside the fireplace repairing the blue scarf once again. Shadow stretched out nearby. The scent of lavender filled the room. Firelight painted the walls gold. The cottage felt warm and peaceful. It felt like home. Aurora eventually set the scarf aside and smiled down at him. "You know something, Shadow?" The wolf lifted his head. "I cannot remember what life was like before you showed up." The words struck harder than any wound ever could. Aurora seemed surprised by her own confession. She looked away first. For a moment, an unfamiliar silence filled the room. Neither of them knew what to do with it. Yet both of them felt it. Something was changing. Something neither laughter nor routine could hide anymore. Later, after Aurora had fallen asleep beside the fire, Lucien remained awake watching the flames dance across the room. He should have been thinking about his kingdom. Instead, he found himself thinking about a girl who smelled faintly of lavender and smiled whenever she saw him. And for the first time since arriving at the cottage, King Lucien Ashford stopped worrying about leaving. He started wondering how he would survive if he ever had to. The storm arrived shortly after sunset. Rain hammered against the cottage roof while fierce winds swept across Silver Lake, turning the dark water restless beneath flashes of distant lightning. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, filling the cottage with golden light and the familiar scent of lavender. Aurora should have felt comfortable. Instead, she felt worried. Shadow had been acting strangely all evening. The giant black wolf paced endlessly across the room. His breathing seemed heavier than usual. Every few minutes he stopped beside the fireplace, only to begin pacing again moments later. "Shadow," Aurora said softly. The wolf glanced toward her. Something in his silver eyes immediately tightened her chest. "You do not look well." He lowered his head. Aurora stood and crossed the room. Rain rattled against the windows. Thunder rolled across the lake. Carefully, she placed her hand against his neck. Heat radiated beneath his fur. "You are burning up." Concern replaced every trace of humor. "Okay, that is enough." She grabbed blankets and arranged them beside the fireplace. "You are staying right here tonight." The wolf looked as though he intended to argue. Aurora pointed firmly at the blankets. No, a pause. That was not a suggestion. Despite everything, one corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Shadow finally settled near the fire. Aurora remained beside him. Hours passed. The storm grew stronger. Rain lashed the cottage. Wind howled through the trees surrounding the lake. Yet Aurora refused to leave his side. Every so often she brushed a hand through his fur. Every so often she whispered reassurance. You are going to be fine. The words were meant for him. Somehow they comforted her too. Shortly after midnight, exhaustion finally claimed her. Sitting beside the fireplace, Aurora drifted asleep with one hand resting lightly against Shadow's fur. Outside, thunder shook the sky. Inside, silence settled over the cottage. Then the air changed. Heat rolled through the room in a sudden wave. Silver light flickered briefly across the floorboards. The fire flared brighter. Minutes later, Aurora stirred. Something felt wrong. Her hand no longer rested against thick black fur. Confused, she opened her eyes. At first, she thought she was still dreaming. A stranger lay beside the fireplace wrapped awkwardly in blankets. Dark hair fell across his forehead. Broad shoulders rose and fell with steady breaths. Firelight painted warm gold across unfamiliar features. Aurora froze. Her heart began pounding. Slowly, the man shifted. Then his eyes opened. Silver. The same impossible silver she had stared into every day for weeks. Aurora's breath caught. The storm disappeared. The room disappeared. Everything disappeared except those eyes. Shadow, she whispered. The man looked at her. Recognition flooded through her so suddenly that she almost forgot how to breathe. The stolen apples. The blue scarf. The walks around Silver Lake. Daisy. The fireplace. Every memory rushed together. It was you, she breathed. All this time. The man nodded once. Aurora stared at him in stunned silence. Then she did something neither of them expected. Slowly, she reached out and touched his face. Just once. As if she needed proof he was real. Warm skin met her fingertips. Not a dream. Not an illusion. Real. The silver eyes never left hers. Shadow, she whispered again. This time the name sounded different. Softer. More fragile. A faint smile appeared. I am sorry, he said quietly. It was the first time she had ever heard his voice. Deep. Gentle. Familiar in a way that made no sense. I never meant to deceive you. Aurora swallowed hard. Her thoughts raced in every direction at once. She should have been angry, confused, frightened. Instead, she noticed something unexpected. The scent surrounding him was the same scent she had come to associate with comfort. Fireplace warmth. Rain on the windows. Lavender drifting through the cottage. Home. Somehow, it had always been him. Her fingers slipped from his cheek into his hand. Their hands remained joined between them. Neither seemed willing to let go. Rain continued falling beyond the windows while thunder echoed across the lake. Yet inside the cottage, an unfamiliar calm settled around them. You still smell the same, Aurora said before she could stop herself. Surprise flickered across his face. Then he laughed softly. The sound warmed something deep inside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply looked at each other while the storm raged beyond the cottage walls. Something had changed. Irreversibly. And for the first time since arriving at the cottage, King Lucien Ashford was no longer hiding. He was simply a man holding Aurora Whitmore's hand and hoping she would not let go. Morning arrived quietly after the storm. Golden sunlight filtered through the cottage windows, painting warm patterns across the floorboards. For a few peaceful seconds, Aurora forgot everything that had happened during the night. Then she opened her eyes and immediately sat upright. A man was sleeping beside her fireplace. The memory returned all at once. Silver eyes. Rain. Thunder. Shadow. Lucien. Aurora stared across the room. The man who had once been a giant black wolf was still asleep beneath a pile of blankets. Dark hair fell across his forehead. One arm rested outside the blankets. Everything about him looked unfamiliar and familiar at the same time. Aurora pressed both hands against her face. You bathed him, she whispered to herself. Across the room, Lucien opened one eye. Good morning. Aurora nearly jumped out of her chair. You are awake. I noticed. For a moment, neither knew what to say. Then Aurora pointed directly at him. I gave you a bath. Lucien closed his eyes. Aurora, a full bath. Yes. With lavender soap. Yes. Aurora buried her face in her hands again. This is the most embarrassing moment of my life. To her surprise, Lucien laughed. The sound was warm and genuine. I assure you, he said. It was significantly more embarrassing for me. Aurora lowered her hands and stared at him. You remember that? Every second. Even when I called you Shadow? Especially when you call me Shadow. Aurora groaned dramatically while Lucien continued smiling. Somehow, Seeing him laugh made everything feel easier. The tension that had lingered since the reveal began slowly fading. Later that morning, Aurora insisted Lucien stay inside while she prepared breakfast. "You spent all night turning into a person," she said. "That sounds exhausting." Lucien watched her move around the kitchen. "I am perfectly fine." That is exactly what someone recovering from spontaneous wolf-to-human complications would say. Lucien had no response to that. While breakfast cooked, Aurora continued stealing glances at him. Every few seconds, she noticed something familiar. The silver eyes. The way he tilted his head when confused. The quiet patience. The habit of watching her when he thought she was not looking. "You still do that," she said suddenly. "Do what?" "Watch me." Lucien froze. Aurora pointed a spoon at him. "Shadow always watched me like that." A faint smile appeared. "Perhaps Shadow was worried you would fall into a lake again." Aurora gasped. "You remembered that story." "I remember all your stories." The admission settled warmly between them. For a moment, neither looked away. Then Daisy chose that exact moment to peck loudly against the front door. Aurora immediately stood. "Daisy." Lucien narrowed his eyes. Aurora laughed. "Not this again." A few minutes later, they stepped outside together. The storm had passed completely. Silver Lake sparkled beneath the morning sun. Fresh droplets clung to pine branches, and the air smelled clean and bright. Aurora carried a basket of feed, while Daisy followed behind her. Lucien walked beside her. It should have felt strange. Instead, it felt surprisingly natural. As they crossed the yard, Aurora glanced sideways at him. "You are taller than I expected." "You expected?" "I do not know. Less tall." "That is very specific." "I spent weeks talking to a wolf. I never had to estimate your height before." Lucien laughed again. Aurora smiled. She liked that sound more than she should have. The realization made her strangely shy. By afternoon, they found themselves sitting beside Silver Lake. The same pine tree overlooked the water. The same gentle breeze drifted across the shoreline. Yet everything felt different now. Lucien sat beside her instead of at her feet. Aurora could hear his voice instead of imagining what he might say. "This is strange," she admitted quietly. "What is?" "You are exactly the same." Lucien looked at her. "And completely different at the same time." A thoughtful silence followed. Then Aurora smiled softly. "But mostly the same." The corners of his mouth lifted. "I am glad." The breeze stirred her hair. Somewhere in the distance, Daisy caused trouble for one of the chickens again. Neither paid attention. For a long moment, they simply sat together beside Silver Lake while sunlight danced across the water. There were still questions waiting to be answered. Secrets waiting to be explained. Yet for the first time since the storm, neither felt any urgency. Because beneath the surprise and confusion, one truth remained unchanged. Whether he had fur or dark hair, whether he walked on 4 legs or 2, he was still the one who had shared her laughter, listened to her dreams, worn her ridiculous scarf, and made the cottage feel like home. And as Aurora looked at Lucien's familiar silver eyes reflecting the afternoon sunlight, she realized something that made her heart beat a little faster. She had not fallen in love with a wolf. She had fallen in love with him. 3 days after the storm, life settled into a strange and wonderful rhythm. Aurora was still getting used to the fact that Shadow now occupied a chair instead of a spot beside the fireplace. Every morning she expected to find a giant black wolf waiting outside her door. Instead, she found Lucien drinking coffee by the window while sunlight reflected in his silver eyes. Somehow, that was even more distracting. "You are staring again," Lucien said one morning without looking up from his cup. Aurora nearly dropped the basket she was carrying. "I am not staring." "You walked into the table." Aurora glanced behind her. She had indeed walked directly into the table. "That proves nothing." Lucien smiled into his coffee. By afternoon, they were repairing a section of fence near the chicken coop. Daisy supervised the entire operation from a position she considered important. Aurora hammered a loose board into place while Lucien held it steady. "You know," she said, "when you were a wolf, you were much less sarcastic. When I was a wolf, I physically could not answer you. That explains a lot." Lucien laughed softly. The sound still made her heart skip in a way she did not entirely understand. Before she could think about it further, a distant sound drifted across the forest. Hoofbeats. Both of them froze. Lucien's expression changed instantly. The easy warmth vanished. For the first time since becoming human, Aurora saw something guarded appear in his eyes. Moments later, 3 riders emerged from the trees beyond the cottage. Their horses carried dark banners embroidered with a silver crest. Aurora had never seen the symbol before, but Lucien recognized it immediately. His shoulders stiffened. The riders dismounted the moment they reached the yard. To Aurora's astonishment, all 3 immediately bowed their heads. "Your Majesty," the oldest said. The world seemed to stop. Aurora blinked once, then twice. "You're what?" The rider looked confused. Lucien closed his eyes. "I was hoping to explain this myself." Aurora slowly turned toward him. "Your Majesty," she repeated. Daisy chose that exact moment to peck at one of the rider's boots. Nobody acknowledged it. "Lucien," Aurora asked. "What are they talking about?" Silence stretched between them. Finally, Lucien exhaled. "My full name is Lucien Ashford." Aurora waited. "I am the Alpha King." The hammer slipped from her hand and landed in the grass. For several seconds, she simply stared at him. The words refused to make sense. Alpha King, the ruler of every pack, the most powerful leader in the kingdom. The man people told stories about during winter nights. The man standing beside her fence holding a wooden plank was that man. "You are a king?" she finally asked. "Yes." Aurora pointed at him. "You stole apples." One of the riders looked alarmed. Lucien looked embarrassed. "Yes." "You wore my crooked scarf." "Yes." "You got jealous of a chicken." The riders exchanged startled glances. Lucien stared at the sky. "Aurora, you are telling me the Alpha King got jealous of Daisy?" Daisy clucked proudly. Despite the situation, Aurora started laughing. Not because it was funny, although it was. Mostly because she could not imagine any version of reality where Lucien stopped being Lucien simply because he happened to be a king. Eventually, the laughter faded. The realization remained. "Why did you stay?" she asked quietly. The question carried far more weight than everything that came before. Lucien looked toward Silver Lake. Sunlight shimmered across the water beyond the trees. "Because I was tired," he admitted. "Tired of responsibility. Tired of being needed by everyone." His gaze softened as it returned to her. "And because this was the first place where nobody wanted anything from me." The riders remained respectfully silent. Aurora listened. "Out there," Lucien continued, "people see a title before they see a person." His eyes met hers. "You never did." Something tightened in Aurora's chest. She thought about the first day, the bath, the scarf, the walks beside the lake, the evenings beside the fire. She had never cared who he was. She had only cared that he looked lonely. "You should have told me," she said softly. "I know. I still would have given you a bath." A surprised laugh escaped him. "I know that too." The familiar warmth returned between them. Not despite the truth. Because of it. For the first time, there were no secrets left standing between them. As evening approached, the riders prepared to leave, promising to return in several days. Duties waited for their king. The kingdom still existed beyond the forest. Yet after they disappeared into the trees, neither Aurora nor Lucien spoke for a while. Together they walked down to Silver Lake. The water reflected the golden colors of sunset. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and spring. "Does everything feel different now?" Aurora asked. Lucien looked at her carefully. "Does it?" She thought about it. Then she smiled. "Not really." Relief flickered across his face. Aurora stepped closer and took his hand. "You are still the man who listened to all my stories." Her fingers tightened around his. "You are still the man who wore that ridiculous scarf." Lucien groaned quietly. "And you are still the man who got jealous of a chicken." "Please stop telling that story." Aurora laughed. The sound echoed softly across the lake. Standing there beside the water, hand in hand beneath the fading sunlight, they both understood the same thing. The truth had changed many things, but it had not changed the one thing that mattered most. He was still Lucien, and she was still the reason he never wanted to leave. A few days after the truth came to light, spring finally arrived at Silver Lake. The last traces of winter melted from the shoreline. Wildflowers began appearing along the forest paths, and sunlight lingered longer each evening. Yet despite the changing season, one thing remained exactly the same. Lucien still found himself standing outside Aurora's cottage every morning wondering how he had become this happy. Aurora found him there one afternoon, staring across the lake with his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "You are thinking again," she said. Lucien glanced over his shoulder. "I do that occasionally. Dangerous habit." He smiled. Aurora stepped beside him and looked out across the water. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Gentle breezes carried the scent of pine trees, fresh earth, and the faint fragrance of lavender drifting from the open cottage windows. Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them no longer felt awkward. It felt familiar, comfortable, like home. Eventually, Aurora glanced at him. "Your riders have not come back yet." Lucien's smile faded slightly. No, the answer hung between them. Both understood what it meant. The kingdom was waiting. Responsibilities were waiting. A crown was waiting. Aurora lowered her gaze toward the water. "You will have to go back eventually." Lucien looked at her quietly. Yes. For the first time since learning the truth, neither tried to avoid the subject. The realization carried a weight they had both been pretending not to feel. A flock of birds crossed the sky overhead. Their reflections drifted across the lake below. "Do you miss it?" Aurora asked softly. Lucien considered the question. He thought about royal halls, endless meetings, noble families, advisors, expectations. He thought about years spent carrying responsibilities that never truly ended. Then he thought about stolen apples, crooked scarves, a ridiculous chicken named Daisy, and a cottage that smelled faintly of lavender. "No," he answered honestly. Aurora smiled sadly. "That is not a very kingly answer. Perhaps I am not feeling particularly kingly today." A laugh escaped her. Lucien watched her smile and felt the familiar warmth that always followed. "Aurora," he said quietly. She turned toward him. Something in his expression made her heart skip. "Before I came here, I thought strength meant carrying everything alone." His gaze drifted briefly across Silver Lake. "I spent years trying to be exactly what everyone expected me to be." He paused. "Then you dumped 2 gallons of freezing water on my head." Aurora immediately covered her face. "We agreed never to discuss that again." "We absolutely never agreed to that." Despite herself, she laughed. Lucien's eyes softened. "Everything changed after that." The breeze stirred her hair. Neither looked away. "You treated me like a person before you knew who I was." His voice grew quieter. "You saw me when nobody else did." The words settled gently between them. Aurora felt her chest tighten. "Lucien, you gave me a home when I did not even realize I needed one." For a moment, she could not speak. Every memory returned at once. The black wolf beside the fireplace. The scarf. The walks around the lake. The laughter. The storm. The silver eyes. "You gave me one too," she admitted. The confession seemed to surprise both of them. Lucien stared at her. Aurora lowered her gaze. Briefly before continuing. "Before you arrived, I thought being alone did not bother me." A small smile touched her lips. "Turns out I was very wrong." The lake sparkled behind them. Somewhere in the distance, Daisy could be heard causing trouble again. Neither paid attention. Lucien took a slow breath. "Aurora, there is something I need to ask you." Her pulse immediately quickened. "Okay." He stepped closer. Not enough to overwhelm her. Just enough to close the distance that had existed between them for so long. "If I return to the kingdom," he said softly, "there will always be responsibilities." His silver eyes never left hers. "There will always be people who need me." Aurora nodded. "I know, but there is only one place that has ever felt like home." Her breath caught. The breeze seemed to disappear. The entire world narrowed to the space between them. Lucien, his voice was steady, honest, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "If I stay," he said, "would you want me here?" For a moment, Aurora could only stare at him. Then she laughed softly through sudden tears she had not expected. "You are the Alpha King. That is not an answer. You rule an entire kingdom." "Aurora." Her smile grew. "You are also the man who stole my apples." Lucien sighed dramatically. "I regret teaching you that story. You got jealous of Daisy. That is still under investigation." Aurora stepped closer until only a small distance remained between them. Her hand found his. Familiar. Warm. "Right. Lucien," she said softly. "You could stay for 100 years and I would still want you here." The expression that crossed his face stole the breath from her lungs. Relief. Wonder. Happiness. All at once. Neither looked away. Neither needed to. The answer they had both been searching for had finally been spoken aloud. And as the afternoon sunlight shimmered across Silver Lake and lavender drifted through the spring air, both of them realized that the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt like something they would face together. That evening, after their conversation beside Silver Lake, neither Aurora nor Lucien felt any hurry to return to the cottage. The sun had already slipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of gold, pink, and violet reflected across the calm water. Spring had transformed the shoreline. Wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, and the scent of lavender drifted faintly through the cooling air. For a long time, they simply walked together. No secrets remained between them. No misunderstandings. No walls. Just two people who had finally stopped pretending they did not belong in each other's lives. Aurora glanced sideways at Lucien. "You know something?" "That depends," he said. "Is it another story about how embarrassing I was as a wolf?" "Those stories are timeless." Lucien sighed dramatically. Aurora laughed. The sound immediately softened his expression. "See," she said. "That look." "What look?" "The one you always get when I laugh." Lucien looked away toward the lake. "I have no idea what you are talking about." "You are a terrible liar." "I am literally a king. And still a terrible liar." The laughter between them faded into a comfortable silence. Somewhere nearby, water lapped gently against the shore. A pair of birds crossed the darkening sky overhead. Aurora slowed her steps until they eventually stopped beside the old pine tree where she had once fallen asleep against Shadow's shoulder. The memory brought an unexpected smile to her face. "What is it?" Lucien asked. "I was just remembering." She touched the rough bark of the tree. "Back then, I thought I was talking to a wolf." Lucien stepped beside her. "You talked enough for both of us." Aurora gasped. "Was I really that bad?" "Aurora. Okay, fair point." He laughed quietly. She loved that sound. The realization no longer frightened her. It no longer felt uncertain. It simply felt true. The breeze lifted a few strands of her hair. Without thinking, Lucien reached over and gently brushed them behind her ear. The movement was small, simple, yet both of them suddenly became very aware of how close they were standing. Neither stepped away. The last light of sunset shimmered across his silver eyes. Aurora's heartbeat quickened, not from nervousness, from certainty. "Lucien." "Yes." "Are you happy?" The question seemed to surprise him. He looked out across Silver Lake before answering. "For most of my life, I thought happiness was something I would find after I finished every responsibility." His voice remained quiet, honest. After every problem was solved, after every obligation was met. His gaze returned to hers. "I was wrong." Aurora felt her throat tighten. "What changed?" A smile touched his face. "A very stubborn woman threw water on me." Aurora immediately covered her face. "You promised to stop bringing that up." "I absolutely did not." He gently lowered her hands from her face. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The world seemed unusually still around them. "Aurora," he said softly. Her breath caught. "I have stood before thousands of people without feeling nervous." One corner of his mouth lifted. "Yet somehow you make this difficult." "Make what difficult?" For the first time since she had known him, King Lucien Ashford seemed genuinely uncertain. "Telling you that every good thing in my life began the day I found this cottage." Aurora's eyes glistened. Lucien took her hand. "You are my favorite place in the world." The simplicity of the words somehow made them stronger. Aurora laughed through tears she had not expected. "That is good," she whispered. "Because you are mine too." Lucien closed the remaining distance between them and wrapped his arms around her. Aurora immediately rested her head against his chest. The embrace felt familiar despite being new, safe despite changing everything. Above them, stars slowly began appearing in the evening sky. Neither hurried to let go. Neither wanted to. They stayed there beside Silver Lake, surrounded by wildflowers, lavender-scented air, and the quiet certainty of being exactly where they belonged. No kingdom, no titles, no expectations. Just Lucien and Aurora. Just home. And when they finally began walking back toward the cottage, their hands remained linked together, neither willing to release the future they had finally found. Several weeks later, life around Silver Lake had settled into something wonderfully ordinary. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. Lavender bloomed beside the cottage porch. The forest shimmered beneath warm spring sunlight, and every morning Aurora woke to discover that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories was somehow already doing chores around her property. "You know," she said one morning while watching Lucien repair a section of fence, "most kings probably have servants for this." Lucien adjusted a loose board. Most kings were never trained by an angry chicken. As if summoned by the insult, Daisy charged across the yard and pecked his boot. Aurora laughed so hard she nearly spilled her basket of apples. Some things, it seemed, would never change. The kingdom had not disappeared. Every few weeks riders arrived from the capital. Lucien met with advisors. He reviewed reports. He made decisions that affected thousands of people. Yet every time those duties ended, he returned to the little cottage beside Silver Lake. At first the advisors had been confused. Then they had been concerned. Eventually they accepted a simple truth. Their king was happiest here. One warm evening, after the riders departed once again, Aurora found Lucien sitting on the cottage porch watching the sunset paint the lake gold. The familiar blue scarf rested around his neck despite the mild weather. "You are wearing that on purpose now," she observed. Lucien looked offended. "It is a distinguished scarf. It is crooked. It has character." Aurora sat beside him, smiling. The scent of lavender drifted through the evening air. For a while they watched the sunlight dance across the water. Then Lucien reached for her hand. The gesture had become natural between them, yet it still made Aurora's heart flutter every single time. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Lucien looked toward the cottage. The porch, the lavender garden, the smoke rising from the chimney, the life they had built together. "The first day I arrived here," he said, "you threw water on me." Aurora groaned immediately. "Not this story again. Then you dragged me into a bath. You were filthy. Then you forced me to use lavender soap. You smelled terrible." Lucien laughed. Aurora joined him. The sound echoed gently across the lake. "Looking back," he admitted, "it may have been the best day of my life." The teasing smile faded from Aurora's face. Warmth filled her chest. "Mine too," she whispered. For a moment neither spoke. The world around them seemed to slow. A breeze stirred the lavender. Birds called softly from the trees. Somewhere beyond the shoreline, water lapped gently against the rocks. Lucien turned toward her completely. His silver eyes reflected the golden sunset. "Aurora." She looked up. The tenderness in his expression stole every remaining thought from her mind. "Before I met you, I spent years carrying responsibilities." His voice remained quiet. Honest. "I believed my duty defined me." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "You taught me that a person can be strong without being alone." Aurora felt tears threaten again. "Lucien, you gave me laughter." He smiled. "You gave me peace." His gaze softened further. "And you gave me a home." Aurora stepped closer. Without hesitation, Lucien wrapped his arms around her. She settled against him naturally, as though she had belonged there all along. No grand speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just warmth. Trust. The quiet certainty of two hearts finally finding where they belonged. They remained like that while the sun disappeared behind the trees. Eventually, Aurora tilted her head back and smiled at him. "You know what is funny?" "What?" "The most powerful Alpha King in the kingdom spent weeks sleeping beside my fireplace." Lucien sighed. "I knew this would never leave my permanent record." Aurora laughed. He kissed her forehead gently. The simple gesture carried more affection than 100 speeches ever could. Much later they returned inside. Firelight filled the cottage with a familiar golden glow. The scent of lavender lingered in every corner. Aurora prepared tea while Lucien added wood to the fireplace. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Then a loud crash sounded from outside. Both froze. "Daisy," they said simultaneously. Rushing outside, they discovered the chickens standing triumphantly in the middle of a spilled basket of apples. Several chickens had joined the celebration. Lucien stared in disbelief. Those were for tomorrow. Daisy pecked another apple. Aurora laughed so hard she could barely stand. "Your Majesty," she said between breaths, "it appears you have lost another battle." Lucien looked toward the heavens as if searching for patience. "I command an entire kingdom." Daisy stole another apple. "And yet," Aurora said, wiping tears from her eyes, "you still cannot defeat one chicken." Even Lucien started laughing. The sound carried across Silver Lake beneath a sky full of stars. Years later, people would tell stories about King Lucien Ashford. They would speak of wisdom, leadership, and strength. They would remember the Alpha King who guided his kingdom through difficult times. What most of them never learned was that his favorite place in the world was not a palace. It was a small cottage beside Silver Lake that smelled faintly of lavender. A place where a crooked scarf hung near the fireplace. A place where apples mysteriously disappeared. A place ruled by a fearless woman named Aurora Whitmore and an unreasonable chicken named Daisy. And every single evening, As sunlight faded beyond the lake and laughter drifted through the open windows, Lucien would look around and remember the simplest truth he had ever learned. He had spent his entire life searching for a kingdom. In the end, he found home.